Welcome back to Habits and Healthspan, an Amway podcast. My name is John. I am here with my amazing co-host, Alyssa. Alyssa, what's on your mind?
Hi, John. Hello, everyone. I have so enjoyed learning about all things health span, and it's just sort of rattling around in my mind. I'm trying to make these healthy choices, and I feel more informed than ever because of the conversations we've been having, which is great. And I still love dessert. So I've been trying to think about these different categories because I am learning so much about how some things that I really love just aren't the best things for me, right? So I've tried to come up with this, not a new category, but perhaps a new way of thinking about it in my mind about what a yes food is.
Yes food. For me, yes food is the food I'm always saying yes to, no matter what. For me, it's popcorn. If I'm at the movies, I'm no longer debating. I'm buying popcorn. It's happening.
You're going for it.
Is that what you mean by yes food?
Not at all.
Swing and a miss.
So but I love that. I love that answer because that's what dessert has been for me, right? But with yes foods, I'm trying to think more along the lines of, oh, this is a food that I really enjoy and I can have like a decent amount of it and I won't get tired of it and it's also good for me.
Checks all the boxes.
Actually, do you have a yes food like that?
Probably still popcorn. But you know what else checks all the boxes? How amazing our two guests are today.
Oh.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have two incredible guests joining us today that we are super excited to learn from. Alyssa, you want to tell us a little bit about them?
Yes, definitely. So we have Dr. Kristin Morris with us today, the principal research scientist and research and clinical investigations. Welcome to you.
Thank you, and please call me Kristin.
Okay, great. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background. You want to tell us just a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, you know, I've always been a scientist, even as a child. I was that child who wanted a telescope and a microscope, and I got them, and this is where that got me. You know, this is what I love, and I think the thing that I love most about science is being able to talk about it to people in a way that they understand, and so that it becomes something that they can apply to their lives. So that's really what I love about what I do.
I love it. This is going to be a great conversation then, because I might not fully understand, but sounds like you're going to be a good guide. Also a good guide for us, we have Dr. Gary Williamson. He's professor, Department of Nutrition, Dietetics, and Food, Faculty of Medicine, Nursing, and Health Sciences at, okay, I might need help with this one, Monash University in Australia.
That's correct. You can call me Gary. I am professor in nutrition, and I've been interested in nutrition for many, many decades. It's an extremely complicated subject, multidisciplinary, bringing lots and lots of different fields together, and I think that's what I like most about it. It's very varied.
Well, fantastic. You know, we can't do better until we know better. So every little bit of learning helps. We're super excited to learn from you. And so, Gary, actually, I think my first question is, we're talking about metabolic health. And before this podcast, I was talking with Alyssa, and we go, we know what metabolic means, right? Yeah, we've heard that. That's a health word. And then we figured out, metabolism, of course. Could you maybe just break down, obviously, I am not a scientist, metabolism. I know what you just generally learned growing up. Could you tell us a little bit about what is metabolism? Where is it working in the body? How's it working?
Metabolism is all of the chemical reactions that go on in the body that keep us alive. But mostly when we're talking about metabolic health, we're talking about specific things that happen in the gut, in some cells, including things like digesting food. All of those sorts of processes related to eating and using nutrients. That's what we're really talking about with metabolic health. So metabolism is really broad, covers everything, but in our discussion, we're thinking about how healthy you are based on metabolism. And I think one key thing about metabolic health is it's not something you can really look at yourself and say, well, I have good metabolic health. You don't feel anything. So, you know, if you have arthritis, if you have a back pain, if you have a sore foot, you feel it. But with metabolic health, you don't really know unless you have some more biochemical type tests done that you might have, you know, your GP measuring your glucose, etc. But generally, you don't feel anything with metabolic health.
That's so interesting you say that, Gary. Prior to just now, I thought I could clock who has a good metabolism and doesn't. I'm reminded of my childhood friend Will, where he could just eat anything. It's like, yeah, he's got a better metabolism than I do.
Usually when that happens, it's due to the person doing more exercise, or the sort of person that sits there and constantly moves their foot when they're sitting down, moving a lot. We all know somebody who sits there and fidgets, all the time. That uses up a lot of energy. So we can be a bit fooled by that sort of thing, because they need to eat more, because it's all to do with energy in and energy out. And exercise definitely is a good way of using up the calories.
So are you saying that if I start fidgeting my leg all the time, I can eat more?
You can't. I've tried it. Trust me, I've tried it. And it lasts about 3 minutes until you think of something else, and then you forget. People who fidget, it's almost like innate to them. So it's not easy to learn.
I guess it's sort of with all things health span, the key is consistency.
Yeah.
Along those same lines, what would you say, Gary, are the major drivers of metabolic health? And how do nutritional factors affect it? Especially, I'm curious to hear about this, especially plant-based nutritional factors. Can you speak to that?
Diet, exercise, sleep, and stress. Those are the 4 things that really affect metabolic health. With diet, there's so many different ways in which it can affect metabolic health. One bottom line really is total calories. But within that, you can still have some more sort of subtle effects of various things like plant-based compounds, all sorts of different nutritional aspects, whether it's what type of fatty acids you're eating. All those sorts of things can affect metabolic health, but they're only going to have an effect if you within certain confines. So if you're going to eat twice as much as you should eat, there's no way that eating any sort of phytochemicals, modifying the types of nutrients you eat, is going to affect anything. So it's definitely, it's a cliche, but it's a balance. But within that, phytochemicals, which are these plant compounds which can affect health, can have quite a big influence, especially things related to metabolic health. But they're not going to make you not going to make you lose weight very quickly, for example. So it's all a balance, and they do have certain effects, but you always have to take that in context of the total calories as well.
And for those of you who are listening at home, if you want to learn more about phytochemicals, we do talk about it with Dr. Ho and Dr. Contractor in episode 2. So go ahead and check that out if you haven't already. Kristin, I'm just curious, based on everything that Gary was just sharing with us, is there anything you'd like to add or perhaps comment on?
I'd just like to build on what Gary said, because it's true. We can't change the laws of thermodynamics simply by eating plant foods. We still have to burn more energy than we consume, right? But I think there are some factors about plant-based diets that tend to favor metabolic health. So, plant-based foods are naturally cholesterol-free, because cholesterol is something only animals make, mammals, right? And so cholesterol, is something that influences cardiovascular risk. So choosing healthier diets and plant-based diets can have a profound effect within the context of an overall healthy diet, right? So it's still about energy balance. It's still about choices made every day. But there are large, studies that tell us even when we're replacing as little as 3 to 5% of total energy per day of animal protein, replace that with lean plant protein, that can have very profound effects on improving risk factors for certain diseases. And as Gary mentioned earlier, you go to your doctor and they measure glucose and insulin and cholesterol and lipids. Those are sort of our markers for metabolic health. But again, diet has such a profound effect within the context of it being appropriate energy balance and making healthier choices, right? So when we talked about foods earlier, I think that we don't like to demonize foods, but I think most often we can look at what we're eating and we know if there's a healthier choice we could have made, and maybe try to make those choices moving forward. But But as you know, as we've said, it really is about balance. But there are things within plant foods that favor health. And phytochemicals are another one. We're learning a lot about what phytochemicals that can do to, in our gut to favor gut health. Something we didn't have that much awareness of, just even 5 years ago.
So as you were talking, Kristin, I kept asking myself, how do I ground this in sort of my everyday experience? We're talking about metabolic health, animal-based, plant-based. I was wondering if you could really bring this just into my kitchen for me and really help me understand metabolic health in my everyday. That's such an official term. And I always think if I can define it for someone else and explain to someone else, then I understand it. But I'm finding myself kind of at a loss. We've had some great explanations, but I'm a little bit of a slow learner. So can you just remind me and the listeners at home or wherever they are, metabolic health in the everyday, what's that looking like?
It's not something we feel unless it's far progressed to a place of being unhealthy, right? But bringing it into your kitchen and thinking about the choices we make every day. There are choices to use olive oil and having more fresh fruits and vegetables. Those are all things that not only bring in they bring in fiber, they bring in those rich, vibrant colors, which we associate with phytochemicals. So they have a structure that our bodies have to break down. They have things that are fibrous and that are have these intact structures that sort of help to delay the absorption or slow the absorption of nutrients like glucose, as opposed to simple sugars. Think of a soft drink versus a piece of broccoli. And what those are two. Those I'm choosing extremes there. But if you think about what the metabolic profile or what your metabolic profile might look like, after having consumed that, you think of something that has a lot of simple sugars, a soft drink, as causing a really large increase in glucose, right? And it's going to fall really quickly too. Over time, that really sort of primes our bodies to have, this or an exaggerated response to glucose, right? And that can help to set up things like insulin resistance. And so what we want to do is we want to give our bodies foods in the forms that would favor a metabolic response that is more associated with long-term health. So, we want fiber-rich foods. We want plants in our diet. We want to choose, and not that we can't have some animal foods in our diet, but lower fat, right? Even things like yogurt can become tricky foods if you think about sweetened yogurt versus, yogurt that with no fat and no sugar. And so I think if we keep in mind that everything that we're putting into our bodies is ultimately going to influence that metabolic profile, it can help us to think differently about the foods that we choose. There's no one diet that, is associated with health, but there are factors about diets that are more associated with longer term health. Those are the things that we want to emphasize. I think plant foods are among those.
I'm all too familiar with having to make the decision between, do I go with food A or food B? And I know where they're at on the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
I have a distinct memory when I was younger that I was thinking I should probably be eating a salad or something. I was in high school at the time. And I had the thought, I said, you know what? When I'm 30, I'm going to have to eat salads. Right now, my metabolism's great. I can eat whatever I want. And so I was eating junk food. Now, as I'm getting closer to 30, I'm kind of going, oh no, I have to reckon with what past John decided to do. I guess that makes me sort of ask, especially as you mentioned earlier, Gary, that you can't just call metabolism out by looking at it on the street. Does metabolism change with age? Does age a factor? Or are there some other factors, diet, lifestyle? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So the intrinsic metabolism definitely changes with age. It's very different in children. And then between about 20 and 60, it stays fairly constant. And then after the age of about 60, it starts to go down a bit less than the basal metabolic rate. sort of about 1% a year, something like that. But that is like the underlying factor that we can't get away from. That's in our genetics, it's in our genes. And it varies depending on people. It's obviously people are different because of their genetics. But on top of that, there's also the amount of exercise you do, the amount of type of food you eat. All of those sorts of things will have an effect on top of that rate. So yes, it just does change with age. And sometimes if you do less exercise with age as well, then you might also your basal metabolic rate might also change, or your total metabolic rate, depending on the exercise. So it's quite complicated, but there's a basal change with age, and then on top of that, there's what you eat, your exercise, and everything else that will change that basal rate.
I think what also happens with age is we sort of become, whether we realize it or not, less active, sort of passively, right? We tend to become a little bit more sedentary, or we just aren't as, we're not playing. I don't know, people are playing pickleball now. I never played that, but I played softball as I was growing up. My knees have paid the price for that, but we just sort of we sort of have eased into midlife, and around midlife is when our bodies start getting a lot better at putting on fat in the middle of our body, that visceral fat. So that doesn't help the situation.
So as you were talking about age, the elephant in the room comes up as we're talking about metabolism. You mentioned putting on some fat. Now, earlier this year, a little bit of last year, I went on a little bit of a weight loss journey. And as I would talk about that with people around me, because it was visible, I would explain what I was doing. And a lot of the women in my life would go, of course that works for you. You're a guy. So my question is, just as how age plays some influence and doesn't play influences, I'm just curious, what role does someone's biological sex have with how their body is interacting with metabolism?
Obviously, there are hormonal influences, and men and women, we have some of the same hormones, but they vary in, the levels throughout our lives, and those can have an influence on our metabolism. Men also are just leaner than women. They have more muscle mass. Muscle is a much more energetically expensive tissue to maintain. It requires a lot more energy. So if you have more lean mass, then it costs more to maintain that. So it is a little easier to, or maybe that's my own bias. It does seem easier for men. Okay, maybe it's not, but I think that's where the your thinking perhaps was, or where the women that you were speaking with when they said, of course you're a man. But again, it's hard to pull out one single factor. Although, I do think there are some sex differences that do influence it.
One of the important things is that men are generally bigger than women, certainly taller, and men have a somewhat higher basal metabolic rate in general than women. If you have a man who's, let's say, 6 foot and a woman who's 5 foot and very slim already, then actually the woman needs half as much food as the man. So in some ways it is easier, because you look at that portion and actually, why should my portion be twice as big as yours? But actually, in terms of sort of calorie intake, that does make sense. So I can understand why women would say to you that it's easier for you to lose weight, because in some ways you can cut down from those larger portions more easily. But there's also a lot more to it than that, because a lot of research in medicine and nutrition has been actually done on men rather than women. So actually our knowledge on men is actually more complete than our knowledge on women. So, and there are some differences, but there's also some similarities. So I think a lot of nutrition research nowadays is a lot more into looking at the differences. And we do find quite big differences. We just take some young men and some young women, and we look at their glucose response in the blood, their sugar in the blood after a meal, and it's actually different between men and women, even just at that sort of fairly simple metabolic level. So there's a lot more differences than meets the eye, even in terms of metabolic health.
I'm curious. So obviously, time doesn't stop, right? We're all getting older, whether we like it or not. Things do change, whether we like it or not. What are some day-to-day practical things we can do knowing our metabolic system is going to change? What are some things that we can do knowing that this doesn't stop necessarily?
Yeah, I mean, the progression and almost like deterioration with age is inevitable, but we can actually do some things to not make it go quite so bad, quite so quickly. And hopefully you can maintain a long, healthy life or health span. So there's many different factors that can affect that. So one is that as we get older, our ability to sense nutrients and nutrient sensing gets worse. So for example, when we eat some sugar, actually our body, as we get older, has more of a reaction to that sugar, so it produces more insulin. That has a bigger effect. That produces oxidative stress in the body, especially in the blood vessels, and that gets worse with age. And there are things that we can eat in the diet that can protect against that. But the thing is, you can't just have like one portion and then not have something, of let's say raspberries or strawberries or something with lots of phytochemicals in, and then leave it for another week and have another one. It's very much a continuing process. So sadly, if you're going to have a healthy diet, you have to do it pretty much most meals, especially as you get older. Your ability to cope with that sort of high fat or high sugar actually becomes worse. But there are some things you can do to cope with that. And there's another thing called mitochondrial dysfunction. So the mitochondria are often called the batteries in the cell. It's not quite true, but they do generate a lot of energy within the cell. As you get older, they get more aged. They get less efficient. So the more we can do to maintain our mitochondria, the better. And that involves the same sort of phytochemicals, which can help to keep mitochondria healthy. But also exercise is important in that respect. Another one is chronic inflammation. So when you have acute inflammation, it really knocks you out. It's really serious. You might have that if you're in hospital. But what you can also have is chronic inflammation. Now, chronic inflammation means that you have a very low level of inflammation for a long time. And that is something that's associated with bad metabolic health, being overweight, having a poor diet. And then the other one is dysbiosis. That's another aging process that can be affected. And dysbiosis is a problem with the gut bacteria, the bacteria in your gut. Everyone seems to know about bacteria in the gut nowadays, but it very much can be associated with a healthy lifestyle or an unhealthy lifestyle. We're still not quite sure how it really affects us, but we just know that it really, really affects us. So keeping a healthy microbiota with lots of fiber is really important as well. So eating high fiber foods helps the right bacteria to grow in the gut. And that's highly simplified, but that's a very important aspect as well. So all of those four things, if you can maintain those, then you will actually help your health span. But it does take work, and it does take almost every meal you should be considering these types of things. But of course you don't, because things like cheesecake's very tempting, isn't it? If you like cheesecake, all those sorts of foods. So a lot of the foods that we actually really like, high fat, high sugar, they're the ones that are not so good for us. So that's a really difficult thing to cope with. It takes a lot of willpower.
And if I could just add to that, there are some other things like getting enough sleep and stress management, and even a sense of community, having community around us. So these are pulled way back from just the effects at the cell, but we do know that these are also things that influence our overall health and wellness. Getting adequate sleep, and that becomes more difficult as we age for some reason. My mother, used to say she only needed 4 hours of sleep. Now she needs 10. But also stress management. To Gary's point about oxidative stress, stress increases oxidative stress in our bodies too. It increases oxidative stress in our gut. We can't get away from the fact that a healthy lifestyle overall is more than diet. It's also adequate sleep. It's managing our stress. It's hydration. It's living in a community and having community support as well. So it really becomes that takes it from that. All of those things lead right to the cell, and all of those things lead right out to you. So it's a number of factors.
I love what you're saying, Kristin, about how it's more. These are the things that you can do to help you in your journey to have a healthy metabolic system, right? The Pew Research Center says that 65% of Americans think that willpower is not enough to lose weight and keep it off. And obviously, as Gary said, it's more than just losing weight when we're talking about metabolic health. But clearly, willpower is not alone. And Gary, you talked about when cheesecake's in front of you. That may be your yes food, but maybe it shouldn't. What I love that you said too is that these are practical things that we can do. Have a community, make sure you're getting lots of sleep. That's what we're always trying to think about here on Habits and Health Span is what can we take from this really solid stuff that we're learning from you and bring it into our everyday. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Well, and I think what we want to think of as health span, which can be a very nebulous or vague term, is that we're really talking about the ability to extend the quality years that we live, right? Mm-hmm. And that's something that we can't start thinking about when we're 50 or 60. We start aging when the day we're born. Our guts start going through changes. We'll never have as high levels of bifidobacteria as when we're an infant, and that continues to decrease. So we have to think about these things and building these healthy habits throughout our lives, and not just when we start to feel, that we're slowing down, because then you're really fighting an uphill battle that maybe would have been a little easier to fight had we started thinking about this in our 20s and even younger.
So we did this study. One of my students did this study where we took people who normally had a low-fat diet and fairly young and slim people, and we gave them a high-fat diet for just 3 days. And in that 3 days, it already messed up their glucose regulation just within 3 days. And there's also published research that shows that if you have 2 weeks on a high calorie, high fat diet, you already in 2 weeks develop some symptoms of pre-diabetes, some markers of pre-diabetes. So sadly it can happen fairly quickly.
And the same, we've also learned from shift workers, looking at individuals who work third shift, and how quickly that can change the way that they respond to the foods we eat, because that's that's outside of what our normal daytime pattern is. So we know that having a schedule that's irregular, so that we aren't getting enough sleep, or so that we're just it's erratic. Those sorts of things are also factors. But this Gary just gave us a perfect example that it's about everyday choices. But those choices have to begin as early as possible.
I'm so glad that you brought up, I guess, eating at irregular hours, because a question that I was curious about was, where does time of day play into the food that we're eating, the choices that we're making, just in terms of aligning with our circadian rhythm? I've heard the wisdom like don't eat and then go straight to bed. Can you just maybe say a little bit about the body's internal clock and how that should be thought of as we're focusing on our metabolic health?
So it's really interesting, because our cells also have clock genes, and some of them are activated by light that comes in through us. So there are clock genes within our body. And so time of day can have an influence. We also know that outside of thinking of whether or not you're eating in the evening or the morning, it's just that we tend to be more insulin sensitive during the earlier parts of the day, say before 2 or 3 p.m. So we can make choices about when to eat our larger carbohydrate meals. The research does tell us different things about eating later in the day, and even the types of foods that we eat later in the day. As human beings in the world we live in today, we're almost never in what's called the post-absorptive state, where we've had a meal and we're fasting. The closest we get to fasting is overnight. And generally, most of us aren't sleeping enough for that to be a full 8-hour fast. There is wisdom to, not just continuing to eat that as we continue, as we get closer and closer to time to go to bed. Our bodies do different things sometimes at night than it does during the day. Substrate utilization, the way that our bodies use carbohydrates versus fats, changes throughout the day as well. So that, one of the reasons I think breakfast is such an important meal is because when we wake, and Gary could probably tell us more about these satiety hormones than I have from his own research, is that when we wake, there's a hormone that's pretty high, that's high because it's telling us to eat, right? When we don't eat breakfast, we tend not to blunt that hormone. So that tends to make us want to continue eating through the day. And Gary, I'm going to throw this to you because, we've worked with you and your research on satiety and how that can play such a role in managing our metabolism.
Yeah, I think that there's both the physiological response to the food, which in the morning, as you said, we're more insulin sensitive, so it's a good time to actually eat sugars and carbohydrates. But there's also the satiety aspect, and satiety is quite dependent on your protein intake. So it's I think probably the best advice would be to have a more sort of fruity breakfast with some carbohydrate and sugar, and then protein at lunchtime, and as minimal amount as you can in the evening. But there is a lot of people who really disagree with that. They will say, I always miss breakfast, and look, I'm so slim. So it's not always the same with everybody. And everybody has different satiety hormones, different ways of sensing, and actually sensing nutrients. But as you become more and more overweight, and even as you become older, actually your ability to sort of sense and have those satiety hormones actually have an effect becomes lesser. So actually, the more overweight you are, the more hungry you feel, as most people understand. So it's a bit of a vicious circle.
But I think to the point of satiety hormones, I think there's also a bit of mindfulness in not overriding our satiety hormones. When we start to get that cue that we're full, then let's listen to that and not just, okay, yeah, I heard you, brain, but I'm going to keep going, because that's part of our internal regulation. So not overriding cues like that are also important.
So I know some teenagers who, including my son, he used to say, I really like to eat fast because it allows me to eat more, because it overrides the satiety hormones. So that's fine when you're 18, 19 and growing, but it's not something you really want to do as you get older.
Yep, sounds like me when I was 18, and now I guess I'm approaching salad year. Oh no.
So these are not necessarily easy habits that we implement, right? We have to be very intentional about making all these choices we've been talking about, and it's never too soon to start making these choices. But because these choices can be so difficult, especially when the yummy things are so yummy, okay? I get why we would turn so quickly to weight loss drugs, but I'm curious, Gary, if you could speak to how do these weight loss drugs impact your overall health, your gut health? What is the impact of these? Because there's certainly, we hear a lot about them right now.
Yeah, there's quite a selection available now, and they do seem to be effective at short-term weight loss. They mostly act by mimicking satiety hormones and acting in that same sort of way. So what that means is that they reduce your desire to eat, and they can be quite effective in the short term. One of the problems with these types of drugs is they are quite potent and they can have side effects. It's not the sort of thing you want to be taking for the rest of your life. And one of the problems with going on a fairly sort of crash course weight loss diet is that many studies have shown that within about 9 months or a year, you're actually back to your original weight, because it's really difficult to keep that weight off. Actually, losing weight is not so difficult, although it's not easy, but actually maintaining that weight after you've lost weight is really, really difficult. And I don't really think those satiety drugs are great, because you don't want to be taking them for your whole life. So we do have some evidence that some of the phytochemicals we've been talking about do have some effects on satiety without the side effects, but they're not going to be as drastic. What you want is something a bit less strong that still has a bit more subtle effect, but is not as drastic without side effect. But that's really an ongoing area of research that we're looking into, really naturally occurring substances in plant foods that might help with satiety. So that's really the trend nowadays. The drugs will always be there because it is such a difficult thing to do, and helping satiety is a really, really good thing. But it would be better if people tried to do that through lifestyle changes. But as we've already said, that is quite a difficult thing to do.
All right. Well, this continues to be just really fascinating conversation. So thank you both very much. I'm curious because as we were talking, I was thinking I talk to my kids about trying to establish some of these good habits, right? And there's that phrase, "Show me your friends, and I'll show you your future." Is there another way that you could say that phrase, something that you would put in place of friends when we're talking about metabolic health, like show me your food choices and I'll show you your future?
Show me your habits, right?
Okay.
Show me your habits. Show me, how much sleep you're getting, your social circle, the color and the variety in your diet. Show me those things, and we can start to show you your future, I think.
Okay. Gary, what would you add?
We have sort of proven questionnaires and where people come along and they write down what they're eating. They keep food diaries or food frequency questionnaires to determine what they're eating. And then those in many, many different studies have been linked to different biomarkers. And there's often some strong associations between what people are eating now and what their future is, how you can predict their health span. And that's sort of scientifically proven together with the biomarkers. So very definitely, if you have a snapshot of what someone's eating now, it's going to be a pretty good predictor of their metabolic health in the future.
All right. Well, this has really been fascinating. I feel like my brain is very full of all this information.
Your brain is satiated.
Exactly. It exactly is. And we have some good takeaways of all of these factors playing an important role in metabolic health: the diet and nutrition, exercise, sleep, our stress management, and the community that we have around us. All of these things are connected to give us overall better metabolic health, better health span. So thank you both for your time and speaking with us today. It's really been a pleasure.
And we want to thank all of you for listening at home. Remember to like and subscribe on YouTube, follow Amway on Facebook and Instagram. And remember, if you want to see your future, look at your habits and your diet. The future's there. See you next time.
Thanks for joining us.